Okay. For folks that are joining in, we've just started talking through how we set the bar on what we would potentially remove from must support. So in the interest of like, let's throw things out in terms of maybe this is the way, this is the formula, and talk about what doesn't work with it, what does work with it, and try to get to something that you could hand off this as an exercise to anyone and they would interpret it similarly. Is that a fair, I mean, at least to try to do that? So I said, so we can talk about major, like a major system, or we can talk about what doesn't work about the numeric approach. What do folks want to start with first? Okay, I'm going to start with the numeric one, and then Lorraine, while we're talking through this, if you can think of like other ways to express what you had mentioned around, large systems or impacted users, some way, so that when we get to it, we can talk about that as well.
Maybe it's the jurisdictional systems.
Okay, what do folks think?
I'm just throwing something out there, I don't know. I'm going to have to switch to mobile in a few minutes too.
So when we talk about jurisdictional systems, we're talking about like assets that are maintained centrally in a jurisdiction. So like a provider registry or an immunization registry, right? Or is there an expanded definition that we should?
Well, it's going to say the Ontario e-referral, right? Which isn't necessarily just run by the ministry, but it's a province-wide kind of system.
But so you mean a jurisdictional guide or an actual like a guide that sits over a tool or a database that a jurisdiction is drafting expectations around?
It could be either, I would think, but
so assets or use cases?
Yeah, that's taking us into the non-use case agnostic pieces. This is what we're trying to lay out here is not an easy thing to lay out.
No. So how would we refine this, folks on the call, to make this, to deal with any of the the queasy feelings we have for this sentence? Or do we feel good about it? That maybe it's, if a jurisdiction, is it that if it publishes the name of the jurisdiction in the guide and we find must support doesn't work, what are the cons of that approach?
This jurisdiction name could be put by anybody creating a guide, though. I wouldn't put that as it in, because Joe Smith could go up and create an Alberta guide on XYZ. So now suddenly we have to consider it in this case? No. It has to be created, or how do I say, adopted by a jurisdiction, or proposed by a jurisdiction rather than some third party.
So like a claim?
By the jurisdiction,
part of
maybe.
Part of the problem here is that we don't have any governance around deciding what is sponsored by his jurisdiction, what's sponsored by Canada, what's sponsored by anybody. So that's making this all harder.
So then is there a different metric?
Because in Alberta, for instance, there is, at least there used to be, a standards committee that decided what met the bar of an Alberta standard.
They'll have this until for Alberta, it'd be pretty easy to say if it's been accepted by our ISCA committee, then, it's an
Yeah.
adopted standard. So that would be the criteria to say it's an Alberta jurisdiction standard or a guide rather than some third party. But it doesn't, and that would also allow a third party to create one that we then adopt too.
Yes, but
So
I was
at
gonna
that
say
point, when it's adopted, then it becomes something to
yeah,
consider.
the challenge is, of course, that happens at the end of the process, not during development, right?
Mhm. Well, that's the thing is we have the process partway through. So if they're working with us, we'll know right at the start that they're doing this. And if we're seeing something pop up like that, it's the kind of thing we would raise to this governance group and say, hey, we've got a use case coming up that's going to have this problem. And that's the time to start looking at it rather than obviously at the end. But if they don't talk to us until they're all finished and that, we can't do anything to help them along the way, right? So there's only so much we can do.
Correct. And the likelihood is if they're not talking to us, they may very well be non-conformant regardless.
Right. So I don't think that's a huge issue because I mean, using our processes, we do try to be proactive and say, hey, if we're looking for something like that would hit this case, we've raised issues before to say things don't match with what we need versus what the
Yeah,
Canada standard is. So
and I
it's
think we've all,
worked.
yeah. So that the consensus process we've got sort of works to make these decisions.
So is the issue that this will catch some, but not all of the places? Like, is it, because folks feel like we would catch some of the places where we probably improperly applied must support in a guide that, even if it was done at the end or done in the beginning, that's claimed by jurisdiction, and that we want to go further than this?
I think one of the challenges is making sure people know that if they've got a problem, they can bring it to this group. Because I think the person who was talking about not being conformant on encounter, we said, well, those things that should be brought forward and we should take them off last week, right? Like just making sure that people know that they can do that, I think is one of the things.
So that's this portion down here, right? So identify areas through a community issue process. And then to, like, this is a secondary piece, which is just like documenting what we're removing, which is similar to what we're doing right now. So, like, do this process existing and this, does that meet our bar of?
I think they're together. So for your spring cleaning process, you look for the ones that have been adopted by jurisdictions and use that as the bar to say it should be or shouldn't be. And then going forward, use the community issue process. So if somebody comes up with something that we don't have an adopted standard anywhere is using it, it can be brought later and then fixed in.
Do you think that that would cover? So one of the things I see potentially coming up with using this as our bar is that oftentimes, at least in the guides that we see in the Canadian Fire Registry, is that there are implementation guides that are really close to a specific implementation that like wouldn't involve an asset at the jurisdictional level typically, and that those are typically, like, maybe another way of phrasing this is oftentimes when we see jurisdictions publishing standards in their cycles, it's around things like their provider registries, their immunization registries, things that are centralized, which creates, I think, a cone of use cases that are very common, but doesn't necessarily say this alone would make us use case agnostic. Because, for instance, I mean, Elliot, you're on the call, like you probably are looking at many use cases that involve the exchange of information with devices, or even like, more sophisticated exchange around like images. Just because it isn't something that we're seeing in a jurisdictional asset or a jurisdictional profile today, I don't know if that means it's use case agnostic.
Yeah.
How do others think about that?
Just from technical perspective, can we see the reevaluate where must support might stay?
So you're saying like, rather than talk about where to remove it, talk about where it should stay, like where
Might stay.
might stay. Okay. So what would you express for that?
Well, somehow I did some homework and I call it implementary optional, those data elements, and just based on my own personal very limited understanding, I realized actually if we have this optional, definitely FHIR profile will be applied at both ends. The more effort actually not come from end to end for the health information exchange, but from that how to process that data after receive the data being rendered into, like, for example, JSON object. There might be some extra, I call it rule sets. It's very, very dependable for the business requirements as you just, go back to I don't know where I find it that the words must support. You have to make sure to have all those solution were set up, be ready how to handle those must support elements, values at the end, at the receiver end. How to, furthermore, I put an X word there based on my understanding or finding there, how to ensure data integration and the data integrity. When you put inside, no matter next step, generally speaking, repository, schema, or another analytical engine. That's where must support need to really specify which is a new down just rule sets or rule set, whatever, how to handle must support. That's why, just personal understanding, why now from the FHIR international community, they might have realized this, I call it uncontrollable issues there, because once you go that way, you just gave it hands to unknown ended implementer to say, okay, you take care of everything. I just leave. So if that's the case, you will see quite different solution comes out, which is break the interoperability rule principle, which is we might have to go through the standardized way to process the data from end to end, which is we call it end and not from the sender to the receiver, but from the one HS repository or processing that endpoint application could go to another end of a repository or another process engine per se, make it standardized. This is a really, really big challenge. That's my understanding. That's why they bring in obligation. They try to put some principle or guardrail to, to constrain how to put this equivalent or similar must support concept into the FHIR specification. However, I would say, well, you can do that, but just based on my very limited knowledge, tunnel vision, we might need to think another more comprehensive way to handle FHIR, because the technology is not only evolving, we go through sort of a revolution age right now.
Yeah.
If we really want to have FHIR to stay and survive, you might think some kind of significant change, not to change itself, but to adopt some, not a concept, not new concept.
So you bring about like a good point here, which is like there are more sophisticated methods that are coming, and must support is being sunset for all of the problems that we've experienced just as implementers in Canada. And so when I started the call, I tried to frame that like it's not just because we're trying to be use case agnostic that we're having this conversation. It's also in the lens of knowing that the tools and the ways that we're expressing right now that are giving us problems are going to be retired, at least, or they're going to quickly be, you know, replaced by more sophisticated ways of expressing expectations. So do we think that like that alone, should that impact our decisioning around keeping any must supports? Because right now, anywhere we keep them will still continue to have the challenges that have been acknowledged by the community and that will eventually be replaced given those challenges. Is there an argument for keeping it? For keeping it in the interim is really what I'm referring to.
May I?
Yeah.
Well, this my another thought about the step may be applicable. First, I would say maybe just give a general one paragraph to see to specify your must support is actually on the reader to go deprecation. It's not invalid, it's deprecation. Another side, and we said, okay, just in case to support backward compatibility, we might provide some guideline or best practice way. Well, no, not best practice. I don't know, no really best practice. Some guideline on all those applications still using this FHIR profiling here and with must support. If you really still would like to take this concept into your implementation, we provide some scenario-based, use case-based example there, for example, and to facilitate all those use case implementers. Say, okay, if you really want to go implement and still would like to take the must support concept into your implementation, that might be some way or avenues you might think about it to implement into your IG, which is not limited to the FHIR, but extended to the architecture and the development, coding's development phase from end to end. That's my thought.
So slightly, because I was thinking originally you meant maybe scenario of like how this would translate in the new obligation structure, but I think that's slightly different than what I was thinking. What do folks think? I mean, I'll go back to the original question, which is like, should it make a difference in our decision about whether or not to do this? And then if it doesn't, we'll talk about like, how do we deal with the forthcoming change if we choose to stick with having must supports applied in the interim. So is there anyone that would argue for having the forthcoming changes around obligation and some of the other conformance structures or expectation structures modifying our current approach to spring cleaning? Okay, so I'll take that as a no unless I hear differently. So I'm going to record no or not right now. Is it safe to say that like if it doesn't make a difference, then we should at least give folks a heads up? Like, do we still feel okay about having this be part of the proposal where we provide folks that awareness that this is changing if we are going to wait in the face of change?
I might talk too much actually. Just make it short. If you really want to provide some message to the implementers and the use case and the implementers. Let them know what exactly the difference between the mouse support and other constrained data elements. Just let them know. The main effort is not in this between the two endpoints. It's after how to process and mouse support tagged data elements. That's where they have to pay more attention or focus on.
Maybe in differences from mouse support is being used. Is that fair?
Yes, but make sure it's actually, when we talk about FHIR, we all think about FHIR just being applied between the two endpoints for data exchange. But mouse support, the impact beyond the endpoints, go through the, let's see, go to the end user, endpoints. When you render the JSON string into JSON object, you have a whole the list there, and you see that actually with the help of FHIR profile, you identify those data elements tagged with mouse support. And then from that point, and then up for the next process is where mouse support implementation will need to focus on.
So if we kind of kept this is the difference, we know it's going to change. We know it's different than mouse support, and we know that that difference is supposed to drive a difference in impacts to end users. Like in 3 sentences in the guide, like, is that enough for us to kind of quell our concerns around this right now? To say, like, our proposal probably, like, if we touch on those points, we'll probably at least be able to guide our readers to understanding while we're continuing to keep the mouse support in the meantime. Would anyone feel like this isn't strong enough? Doesn't have to be detailed, but like, just this is this is the way forward from a proposal.
I think if we're gonna keep them, then we need to make it clear that if they're creating problems for anyone, they should come forward. Because I think actually most of them should go.
So let's talk about most of them, because I actually have, and I apologize, Lorraine, because I think you're on the phone now. But what I tried to do in hopes that this would guide our how do we create a formula is to pull up an example of our current allergy intolerance profile, which has kind of that generic scope. We have in our current allergy intolerance profile a must support flag on code, a must support flag on patient, and a must support flag on reaction.manifestation. And so, like, when we look at our spring cleaning exercise, sometimes it can be helpful to try to put something against this to see if, okay, well, would that get us to where I think we intuitively feel like the must support should be? Would the process that we defined earlier, where if it's in a jurisdictionally claimed guide and it's not present, do we think that that would remove us the must supports that we have currently in allergy intolerance? Would that be enough to get to the point where, like, you could sense it was in the right place? Because my fear is that, like, that's the due diligence review process that, like, we established, and, like, obviously there's more guides to review now, but we started to see less and less return off of every guide that we were reviewing. And so, like, is it enough just to look at what's being published in the Canadian FHIR registry that's being claimed by the jurisdictions?
Well, for instance, do we think that in all the different care settings where we're tracking what people's allergies are, that they all process manifestations? And I suspect many, many do not.
As
an example.
Yeah. Do we think that that would show? So we suspect that that would be the case, that they wouldn't they wouldn't show up. Do we think that that's the kind of, that there were guides in the CA baseline fire registry claimed by jurisdictions that would lead to that confirmation?
I don't think we have enough of them yet. But I think we should, my personal opinion is that, you know, the must support should be something that we do. It should be the exception rather than the rule. We should be thinking carefully and applying it when we really think we need it. Rather than the other way around. But and I realize it is the judgment call. So probably patient and code, but I don't know, is it even code? Now code is a codable concept, right?
Yep, in this case, yeah.
You can still provide text. Because not all of our allergy databases have everything that you could be allergic to, for instance. But if we got a codable concept, you can still provide text, so that's okay.
Yeah. So like, maybe because I think the original process said like, would we expect this in every care setting? So I think that if we were following that rule, the example that you provided around like a lot of folks aren't capturing reaction manifestation in a number of care settings, like that alone would probably remove some of this. But how do we like, do we have to give, how many care settings does it have to not apply to in order for us to remove it? Is one enough? That's really what I'm trying to get at, is like, if we can come up with an example of, it's unlikely that in this scenario, allergy reaction manifestation would be expected.
If we want to be a baseline, I think one care setting is enough. Now, if we're writing a guide for managing an allergy registry or the care assessment of a patient or something else, then maybe there's a must support there in a specific use case. But if we're talking about baseline, I think if we think it doesn't apply in one of our care settings, I think that's enough to say we don't say it's must support.
I would.
Reaction is optional and not must support. So it's only if you provide a reaction, then you should be providing a manifestation. And really, manifestation is a required element, right?
Yep, if you're providing reaction.
Yeah. So if we're not saying anything about the reaction itself, then obviously you only provide that if you have a manifestation anyway. I think what that must support does say though is that if you receive manifestation, you have to do something with it, as must support implies. So I think that would be the grounds on which we can say, yeah, maybe we can relax that element, that if you can't do anything with that information, then we get rid of it. But the fact that the reaction itself is optional and not must support, I don't think that was enough reason to get rid of the must support on the manifestation.
So
one caveat I would add on this stuff was when you say one case, if that one case only represents, like 0.01% of interactions in a system, does that really count as enough to say that the other 99.99% shouldn't have it as must support? Like, I think there's a how do you say, not just use case, but like how likely is that use case?
I said one care
Should be
setting,
fact.
I said one care setting, not one case.
Okay. But again, I would just consider like, what's that volume? If that's a really tiny fraction of everything, so like everybody does it one way and there's one spot they do it different. I mean, there's some level in there we have to go for, but
do you mean like lab systems make sense as a care setting, but if we were talking about like a specific setting of labs that was around like
the lab that they run beside the car accident when they're checking somebody's
Yeah.
blood type before they give them a transfusion, well, that one specific case shouldn't really override a must support, because that's not a very frequent situation, relatively speaking. That's all I'm saying. Like, I don't know where the numbers come in on those kind of things, but we have to make sure that one situation that's saying we should change it really is a significant case, not a blip.
do we get around that by saying like, we'll start by developing a list of the care settings we're evaluating against, and then as we hear things, like cases that come up, we determine if the list needs to be refined, because that would allow us, without having to set within like the proposal what the care settings are, would allow us that ability to kind of apply a little bit of good judgment at the beginning, and then as we evaluate and hear cases come up. Would that be enough?
I'm just pointing out the view that this case, I'm not sure what the real proper solution is. So whatever you guys can figure out is what we go for, I guess. Because I've seen it pointed out for other things that there's very infrequent cases being pointed out, and then that's being used as justification for removing some other thing that used 99.9% of the time. I just don't want to see that happening. Unless there's a good reason.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
How did-
go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Thomas.
I think a little bit of broader scope here. If you look at energy intolerance, maybe a little bit out of scope, maybe off the track, but is really relevant. I quoted context here. Well, if you look at this allergy element, tolerance, and here to go through this condensed view and to remove all those cardinality with 0 start, what a kind of condensed or mandatory data elements you can see here. That's I think the start point to think about, which is actually I quoted based on my thought or my term is class characteristics. Without main class characteristics, this class is meaningless. That's where the mark, the identity, not identifiers, identity of this class. So those data elements which represent the class characteristics should be treated as mandatory. And then from that point, we move forward, then we'll talk about sort of optional, but as value added, treated as a must support. But the must support is really debatable here. And, we spend so much time here. Sorry to see that, but definitely this is really things need to be given to just provide some best practice guidance and for the use case implementer to decide, because business always so versatile, so robust, so unpredictable. I call it unpredictable. And you really hard tell one template can fit all those business requirements. Just stop here.
Yeah, and I think like that's where my brain like was kind of going around, like it's really hard to create this formula that will get us this like really slim cut of where we are today, because either like, we rely on the evidence and have a really long tail for how long it takes us to actually get there, because we're dependent on like business rules to manifest themselves elsewhere for us to compare to, or we can be proactive about it and remove it without losing the progress that we've had to date, but to allow for like this understanding of this is what we've learned so far at this point in time, without necessarily like kind of continuing to tie ourselves to a process that could take years before we got at the answer of, some of our resources. So it's a broader brush approach, which is like, but I think if the community is not comfortable with it, then I think we have to be able to define what our fine brush looks like. I think we can't just say we want to keep them, but not communicate exactly how we landed on this was use case agnostic. So we've got 5 minutes left. Do we think that the set of rules that we have here are enough that if as a profiling stream, we started to go through and did the spring cleaning that we spoke to would get us to where we're looking to be or get us close? Or do we need to take more time as a community defining what these look like before we can execute on it?
I would guess that we could probably refine our definitions as we go, because this is a good starting spot.
So if these are the ones, and I'll have to copy the additional examples here, but like, does that tell us we have enough crystallized right now that for the spring cleaning portion, like, is anyone not comfortable with this part of the proposal being kind of formalized and changing our behavior moving forward on what we're going to be doing in the baseline calls for profiling? I think acknowledging that obviously, like, we will have to see how this goes. I think maybe that's part of it. But do we need more time to talk about these other aspects? Like, if we need to say anything more about proposal for community issue process, or what we'd be writing, like the points we'd be making, I think, in the guidance section around must support and our recent kind of slight tweak in our process. Rita? I see that your hand's raised.
Yeah, I was wondering if maybe rather than going the must support route where I don't think that we can say that absolutely every use case is going to use this element. I think that's a hard thing to say. It's like never say never. But what Loink has done with their mappings and their codes is they give this frequency of use, like how many people have mapped to this particular Loink code. Could we do something similar to that and introduce a rank for an element to say, 90% of adopters will include a manifestation and take it from there, or 90% will include a code, an allergy code. And that would give adopters some idea of how important this element is and how many people are actually using this element. Would that sort of a designation be helpful and not necessarily validatable? Because it's very hard to say that absolutely everybody is going to use this element.
What do folks think? I mean, maybe as a means of, maybe it's not an either or scenario, but like an additional set of information if it's possible. Because I think
Right.
the point of beginning was like, if it's not computable, unless that piece, that claim changes, I think it'd be hard to change the rest of this portion unless there was some computable means of assessing that or interpreting it. But should I add it as like an additive, like as part of what we're trying to express to give an idea? I think maybe we'd need to, I don't know how Loink gets at the usage, but like maybe I'll say further explore.
Tracking usage would be really challenging, to be honest. I mean, it would be nice if there was a way to do it easily, but I don't realistically think there's a way you can do that without sitting there and going and counting each one you've looked through and said, oh, it's using it. But then the case becomes is how many people are using that particular iGuide? If you got 10 iGuides that have it one way and one that doesn't, and the one that doesn't is used by 500 installations, and the other 9 are used by 5 installations combined, which way is the right way?
I think it's certainly an interesting idea, and like there may be more that's available to us now in like the recent releases of FHIR that might merit at least exploring, because there may be more, there may be slightly similar things around computing use. But at least can we say, like, we're not holding ourselves to this, but like as part of this, we'll consider the ways that usage could be expressed, conveyed. I just want this proposal to land in a place where we're like, yep, we feel good. We can just act on this now and we can move forward. Do we
Part of our
need,
challenge is the idea that if we're going with the case, as Rita put in there, that we have to know that everybody's going to use it, then if that's the criteria, then we can't use my support anywhere, because somebody can come up with some use case that doesn't use it.
Mhm.
And I don't think that should be the criteria. I think the criteria should be, you should be using it in most cases, and have a criteria for not, have a reasonable case why you don't in those exceptional cases.
So do we need another session to talk through this? Or do we think that what we've documented gets us to that end?
Yeah, I mean, I think like I said before, I think we have a place we can start, but I don't, my only concern is I don't think the criteria should be that we can't think of a case where it's shouldn't be there, or, that fault, proving the negative is impossible.
Mhm.
And so what we have to really go and say, we think this is something that should be in every use case. There might be exceptions, but in the general situation, or the vast majority, that's what it should be. And that's, I think, how we have to look at stuff.
So I,
This is the end of the meeting.
Yeah.
I just very quickly, give some thought here. I would like to, maybe all those folks here have this knowledge already. When we talk about business here, we talk about how to utilize the FHIR standard here. We start from business requirements, and then we render PDD. From render PDD, and then we draft FHIR specification, try to utilize it in the implementation. From this process, we can try to review where the baseline stands on. And then we know, should we spend time on mass support or not?
So is that a vote in the direction of, we still need to have, like, this can't be a made decision about executing on this?
There's no data minimum standard that for this baseline profiling stand on to talk about so far.
So I think what I will say is, in the interest of a formal decision, right now, what we've communicated is the end of day. Let's say, I think it would be like end of day in our last province, so midnight in our last province or territory. If you believe that this conversation should continue and that we should not move forward with at least what we've discussed, use the forum thread that we've established on because like we need to get at that answer of like, is this closed? If we're trying to follow a formalized governance process, we need to be able to say like, we want to continue talking about this and refining, or we want to move forward with what we have documented and continue refining as we go. So I'll put it to each and every one of you. If you don't feel confident about moving forward with the proposal as it stands that we've talked about and that will be uploaded into the own cloud, go to the forums before tonight and express that, or reach out and say, I think we still need to talk about this, because I'm not getting a clear answer about yes or no. And if I'm not hearing, yes, we need to still talk about this, I think we have to go into execution phase. Is that fair?
Sounds reasonable.
Okay. All right. I'll put it in the own cloud so you folks can read along, and the recording should be up there shortly as well. Thanks, folks. Cheers.
Good weekend, everyone.
Thank you.
Jordan.